Welcome. My name is Anthony Mills. I'm the Executive Director of Global Innovation Institute. Welcome today to our webinar. This is a webinar that's being hosted and sponsored by Global Innovation Institute, and we're glad that everyone could join us for this webinar. Today, our guest on the webinar is Mr. Cris Beswick. I'll introduce Cris and tell you a little bit about him, and after that, I'll tell you a little bit more or give them a segue into what we're going to be hearing about today. So Cris is a serial entrepreneur turned strategic advisor. He's a best-selling author and keynote speaker. He's recognized globally as a thought leader on innovation strategy, leadership, and culture. He's helped some of the world's most ambitious CEOs, companies, and governments build innovation ecosystems and increase their innovation maturity. Cris is a board advisor at GI&I. He's a visiting professor of innovation at several different business schools around the world. He's also co-founder of the innovation consulting firm Outcome. Cris is the founder of the global innovation thought leadership platform called The Future Shapers. And finally, he's the co-author of the best-selling book, Building a Culture of Innovation. So welcome, Cris, to our webinar today. And thank you for being our guest. We look forward to hearing what you will share with us today. I'm sure it will be a very enlightening discussion. Cris is going to spend about 40 minutes or so presenting his insights to us. And then after that, we'll spend 20 minutes or so with question and answer at the end, where we'll be able to ask Cris questions and have him answer them and so forth. In terms of Cris's presentation today, what I'd like to say to sort of set the groundwork for that and give it a foundation to get our minds in that gear, is that today now we live in a time where we really need to be asking ourselves bigger questions and then solving those bigger questions. And in order to do that, we have to ask those questions internally inside of our organization so that we can build a powerful innovation system there. And so that's what Cris is going to be explaining to us today and sharing with us. So with that, Cris, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. All right, let me, hopefully tech won't defeat us before we've got started. This is always the nervous bit for me, where I try and get things going. Let me know if, Anthony, can you see that as you did before now?
Yes, it is in presentation mode and it looks good. Very good.
Fantastic. Right, well, welcome everyone. As Anthony said, it's a real pleasure for Jeannie to do these things. It's a real pleasure for me to be your speaker today. It's great that Anthony asked me to do this. Let me tell you a little bit about me over and above what Anthony's already said, and then I want to shift on from that and get straight into telling you what I'm going to talk about. So really quickly, for those of you that don't know or haven't heard of me, obviously my name's Cris Beswick. I run a boutique advisory firm with a guy called Dan Toma. And if you haven't heard of Dan, I'm sure you've probably seen already his book. Dan is one of the co-authors of The Corporate Startup. And as Anthony said, I sit on the board of advisors for the Global Innovation Institute. So without laboring too much on me, what I want to talk to you about today is I want to give you an insight into the conversations that I have with CEOs and senior either boards or senior executive teams. And the slides that I've got for you, I've tried to position as questions. And as questions that come up in the meetings that I've had over the last few years, but even more so over the last 6 or 7 months. And the reasons for that, globally are obvious. So the point to today is for me to share the questions that keep me up at night in terms of how do I help CEOs answer them. And obviously these are the questions, or some of the questions, that are keeping CEOs of some of the big global corporates and brands that we all will know and love. And these are some of the things that are keeping them up at night. And this series of questions stemmed from one conversation I had well over a year ago now, where a CEO and a senior team in that typical boardroom setting said, Cris, does culture really still eat strategy for breakfast? And we referenced that famous Peter Drucker quote. And we had, off the back of that, myself and that particular CEO and that senior team had a really rich conversation about whether that statement still rings true today, and whether culture alone is enough to eat strategy for breakfast, whether culture alone is enough to deliver the kinds of things and results and expectations that we have, that our clients have for us. And all of the questions that I'm going to share with you have been in response to that and me sharing that question with other CEOs. If any of you are frantically trying to make notes and things like that throughout today, I mean, feel free to do a screenshot and screen capture if anything resonates or you want to save it. But we have got a PDF of all of these slides, which we're more than happy for any of you to have. So if this is something you do want to present back into your business, then feel free to use the PDF. So the first thing I want to talk about is one of my big frustrations. And that big frustration is still the amount of innovation theatre that is still evident across the world, across many big corporates, and even corporates that we may look at from an external perspective and think, wow, these guys are really innovative. You know, they're doing some really amazing stuff, and the things that we see, it just looks and feels like these guys have really got innovation nailed. And from my perspective, what we see on the outside is often very different to what is actually taking place on the inside. Many of the clients that I go into have the external perspective is that they're super innovative and that they've got a culture of innovation and that they've got everything licked. And the reality is, if I'm asked to go into a client like that, then it's because the reality is far, from that truth. So just to kick us off with some light-hearted overviews on innovation theatre, because it's easy to be sort of, really overplay this and be a little bit, too over the top on how much innovation theatre there is. Hey, just some illustrations from, if any of you don't know the guys over at Collective Campus, there's just some really cool illustrations, that typical meeting room, and then that traditional, let's go to Silicon Valley because all our innovation answers will be solved if we only spend a few days out there and soak up by osmosis, we'll come back super innovative. And then here's another one, that rallying cry that we've all heard from a CEO or a senior team, we've got to set something up and look like we're innovative. Let's just build a lab. Surely that's the answer. And obviously, as we know from all the stats, I think the latest stats are that there's more innovation labs being closed down than there are being opened at the moment. Because unless they are part of the system, that whole innovation system, then they simply don't work. So I want to frame this in the context of the kinds of problems that we should be putting innovation to work for, towards solving. And innovation now should be the answer to what we know, that phrase, that term, wicked problems. And COVID's been a real inflection point, I think, for many of the CEOs that I work with, and they're now starting to use more language, more like wicked problems, or language in that vein, where innovation is now being positioned as something way more valuable than it was even just a year ago. And I think that partly sits in the place of how much innovation theatre there was even just a year ago, even in February before COVID. And we have to now take on board that wicked problems, some of these real systemic big changes that we need to make as organizations, huge transformations, whether it's in how we operate, whether it's in the products that we sell, the experiences that we provide. These are much more wicked than they were even 7 or 8 months ago. And those wicked problems require really wicked solutions. They require solutions that are demonstrably different. They require approaches and ways of thinking that are demonstrably different than even just 7, 8, 9 months ago. And the questions that I'm going to share with you today are in response to senior teams and the conversations I'm having with them, recognizing that the challenges they face have got bigger and have become more wicked. So this first slide was a poll that I did in a session just like this. It's a poll and a little question and answer session that we did at the start of a session to try and unpack from that audience what they thought their biggest barriers to innovation were, or what they thought their organization's biggest barriers to innovation were. And we've categorized it into the 3 sections you can see on screen: strategy, leadership, and culture. And it's that framework that or that structure I'm going to share with you today. I'm going to talk to you about strategy problems and some of the things we can do to solve them, the same with leadership, and then the same with culture. But it'd be really interesting for you guys to just take a minute when you get the PDF or when you reflect back on this session and have a look at some of the real common barriers to innovation and see how many of them resonate with you and with your organization. And the typical ones, as we can see here, is in terms of strategy, innovation really fails to take hold and to embed when there's a real lack of strategic clarity around innovation, and specifically when there's a lack of an innovation strategy, or there's a lack of innovation being properly aligned to corporate strategy. And leadership fails in terms of innovation when there's a lack of leaders really understanding how to lead for innovation. So not how to become innovation leaders. It's not about leaders being the innovators. But what leaders really need to understand now more than ever is how to be a leader that can build the kind of environment and the kind of ecosystem where innovation can thrive. And then the final component was a fairly simple one to understand. The problem with culture as a barrier to innovation is, in no uncertain terms, the problem with existing corporate culture. And with existing cultures never really being built on the whole to drive innovation, with metrics and KPIs and the expectations of organizations wanting their people to behave and do things in a certain way and be governed by and measured by certain metrics. And all of those things, that old system, that old culture, typically and traditionally isn't really conducive to driving innovation and the behavior that we want and need in order to deliver innovation. So culture is something really close to my heart. As you'll have seen on the cover of the slides, the last book that I wrote was called Building a Culture of Innovation. So the cultural component and the leadership component are 2 things really close to my heart. So here's some thoughts on strategy. The first thing I think is, and again, as you'll see, this is a question, and on each of these slides, predominantly the tops of them are questions that I've helped organizations and senior teams answer over the last, well, I've been doing this for a decade, but specifically over the last year or 2. And I want you to ask of yourselves and your organizations when you go back into them, albeit virtually for many of us, ask yourselves these questions. And this first one is, do we really have a definition of innovation? Do we really and clearly communicate what innovation is across our whole organization? Does everyone in our organization really understand what we mean when we talk about innovation, and when we use the word, and when we label things with that innovation badge? And I think the challenge here is, one, we've been very unkind to the word innovation over the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years. We've devalued the word innovation because it's now everywhere and anywhere. And in many instances, the word innovation has been used, blatantly out of context. So it's not surprising why most employees and even most leaders and many organizations aren't really clear about that definition of innovation, about what it really means. The challenge with that is, how do we build strategy? How do we build action? How do we build behavior in line with something that we can't accurately define and people are unclear about? So here's a really quick insight into how we help organizations build their definition of innovation. And this is a framework that we then convert into their language. The first thing to understand is the typical definitions of innovation, and the dictionary really talks about invention, not innovation. So most of the definitions around innovation are something similar to what you'll see at the top here. Innovation is the creation or the introduction of something new. And yes, that's right. That's a component of it. But my view is that the definition of innovation needs to do more than that and needs to provide much more clarity. So here's how we help people and senior teams and organizations define innovation. First of all, I think it has to have 4 components. I think the first thing is still about the introduction of something new or different. But we've then got to clarify what that means. And on the whole, when we're trying to innovate, what we really need to focus on is, how do we solve a problem or capitalize on an opportunity? So for me, the second part to this definition should be the process of introducing something new or different in order to solve a problem. The third thing is then, competitive advantage isn't driven just by solving a problem and providing basic solutions to needs. It's then about adding more and adding value, whether that's because something's beautifully designed, because it's affordable, because it's easily accessible, or because it's part of a system and it integrates with something else. What else does our solution actually provide? So what added value does our solution give to the customer? And then the final component is, how do we then drive growth for us as a creator? And we very specifically not used the word revenue, and we've very specifically not used the term ROI, because driving a return and driving growth isn't always about a fiscal return. Depending on the problem and depending on what organization you're in, you might be solving a problem for customers or for the people you serve, and the end result might not necessarily be a financial one that you're trying to achieve. So think about those 4 things in this way. Being new and different is great, but is our solution, is what we're trying to do really interesting? When people look at your solution, do they say, oh, okay, what's that over there? Now that's interesting. Compared to those others, I like that. What's that? Show me more. And then think about how useful this definition is when you're using it in the organization. So points 2 and 3 here are actually, they center around value proposition design. So solving a problem is all about, how do we relieve pain, if you're familiar with value proposition design. And adding value is, how do we create gain for the customer? And then finally, can we do it as an organization really well? Can we execute it? Can we get it to market? Can we derive a return, depending on what that is? And if you think about these 4 components, where this kind of definition becomes interesting now is, you can use this as a tool as you push through the innovation process. At any point when you're validating assumptions or validating whether your solution is on the right track, you can sense check with these 4 things. Is it still interesting? Does it still relieve the pain and solve the problem? Does it still add more and create gain? And are we still able to do it and execute it really well and derive a return? So the definition of innovation itself becomes a useful part of your toolkit, rather than just an ambiguous statement that's thrown around the organization. Another question that came up was, are we genuinely structured as an organization to pursue innovation? So ask yourselves whether your organization is genuinely structured to do that. And this is a great quote from T. Glenihan at Fjord, which is part of Accenture, which focuses on the reality that human-centered approaches aren't now a nice to have, they're absolutely integral to how businesses drive value, shape the future, and innovate. So ask yourselves whether your organization is genuinely structured to be human-centered, because without that, it's difficult to pursue innovation. And also unpack in your organization and ask yourselves whether you really understand customers. We talk about in organizations about really knowing our customers and really understanding what they want. And the reality is many organizations don't really know exactly what the customer wants. They understand what they presume the customer wants from the stories that customers tell. And as you can see on the left here, you know, if you understand jobs to be done framework, then we have user stories, which is what most organizations who fail at innovation end up doing. They listen to those user stories and generate solutions off the back of them. The ones that excel really understand the job story. What's the customer trying to do? What pain are they in? What are they suffering from? What are they not able to do? Or what are they trying to do but can't do very, very well? And understanding the difference between user stories and job stories is part of being human-centered. But you have to work really hard at that. You have to build that muscle and build that capability as organizations. Otherwise, you develop solutions based on dangerous early assumptions. And a final thing about strategy is, I think we can't diminish the impact that COVID has had, and we can't dilute the damage and the loss of life that the last 7 or 8 months has caused globally. But in times like this, as we had with Lehman Brothers, and again, I'm not comparing the crash post Lehman Brothers with the impact that COVID's had, but as a business and a corporate situation, the amount of innovation, the amount of high value organizations that were created post 2008 is astounding. And some of them I've listed there on the left. What we need to do now is be organizations that choose to follow in their footsteps, that choose to capitalize on the change and the disruption that's happening at the moment. We need to be organizations and we need to be leaders that choose to shape and create the future. And to do that, we have to make a choice to start in the future. What we can't do is follow the typical approach to strategy, which is to say, we're in 2020 today, let's create a plan for the next 2 or 3 years and then unwaveringly just implement that over the next 2 or 3 years. Those old approaches to strategy sign off and then an implementation phase are dead. We have to make a choice about what we want the future to look and feel like. We have to make a choice and we have to choose to design and create that future. And fundamentally, that's what innovation's about. We have to make that choice to build and depict what we want that future to be, and then use a hypothesis-driven approach, an iterative approach to strategy, and a human-centered approach to how we uncover problems and opportunities to move forward from today towards that vision of the future that we create. So a few thoughts on leadership now. The first thing for me is, never, I think, has there been a time when the VUCA terminology has been more apt. And, you know, huge numbers of the leaders that I work with are citing this as, you know, that's a perfect depiction of the world we live in and operate in today because of COVID: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But as leaders, imagine the mindset that believing and waking up every morning and saying that we're still in that VUCA world, it's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. Imagine the mindset that puts you in, and imagine how that affects the decisions you make, the environment and the ecosystem you create, and the culture that you create. And imagine now how that affects the people that work with and the people that you are there to inspire and drive forward on a daily basis. And I think this is one of that negative mindset is one of the big challenges for leaders at the moment. I think one of the other challenges is maintaining a mindset where we think that what has worked up to date will continue to work in the future. And this great quote from Gary Vaynerchuk: overvaluing what worked yesterday is killing our opportunity to find out what works today. Another great phrase, quote I came across yesterday from the business guru Gary Hamel: the main reason companies miss the future is that senior leaders fail to write off their own depreciated intellectual capital. And I think that's a great way to sum up. We need to figure out what doesn't work anymore, whether that's mindset, actions, and behaviors, and we need to reframe them and retrain our minds to lead for the kind of future that we want to build. And I think that future needs to be more purpose-driven and more vision-driven than ever before. And I really like this from Elon Musk: if it was about money, if I was in this just for money and just for shareholder return and just for my own personal gain, I'd build another internet company. What he's doing and what other great leaders have done is to pursue a bold vision of a future that they genuinely believe is achievable. A lot of the work that I do is about helping leaders switch into that mindset. How do we put innovation at the heart of their organizations? And I think the first thing is being really clear on the purpose of your organization and the vision, i.e. what you want to achieve. I think language is really clear, and this great quote from Sam Walton: we don't just want to be the best for customer service. We want to be legendary. We want people to view what we do as legendary, not just good, because other people can be good and will also be good. And this again is about the use of language and how inspiring that is on a daily basis when you're trying to convey purpose and trying to convey the fact that tomorrow will be better and that the future is bright. And we know that creativity, those wicked problems require wicked solutions. We know creativity is absolutely key. And we know that we can't solve the problems of today and tomorrow with the same kind of thinking that created them, or the same business approaches that have got us to today. And creativity has been proven to be a real core quality and capability that leaders now know and recognize that they need in order to succeed. And not about succeeding today and in the future, but in terms of understanding how to build creative environments. Understanding how to do that is key for innovation, and understanding how to do that is key for building that culture of innovation. So this isn't about leaders being the creatives and being the innovators, but it's about understanding as a leader how creativity works and how to drive it and how to own the innovation agenda. Understanding how to build the kind of environment and the culture where innovation is a natural byproduct. And to do that, I think it requires two really core components. And there's a whole framework that sits below this. These are just the two sort of outline components. I think leading for innovation is about being able to mix a bit of Martin Luther King with a bit of Einstein. It's about being much more purpose-driven, much more visionary, and also understanding how creativity and strategic creativity, i.e. creativity in the context of solving strategic and business problems, understanding how to be better at both of those as a leader. And as you'll see from the bubble in the top right there, my belief is that when we blend these and we show leaders how to be more purpose-driven, more visionary, and more creatively led, that combination makes leaders more curious. And curiosity turns us into explorers. And when we're comfortable exploring, it means we're more comfortable experimenting. And when we're comfortable experimenting, then cool things happen. There's a great phrase I heard a few days ago, and I can't remember who said it or what business it was from, but the phrase said, "Don't bring me more ideas, bring me more experiments." And what we need to build is organizations that are brilliant at experimenting, and that starts with leaders and leadership mindset. So the summary for me is, shifting leaders from thinking the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And leaders that own the innovation agenda for me are my new version of VUCA. They're visionary. They're unbounded by what they believe their organization can achieve. They're creative in how they approach that. And above all, they're authentic. You know, we don't have to question whether we trust them or whether they're being disingenuous in that pursuit because they want us as employees to deliver more. And that authenticity is really important in a world at the minute which is filled with a lack of trust. So the final thing is I want to talk to you about culture, one of the things that's really close to my heart. Ask yourself and whether your organization is really shifting its development and acquisition of skills and people with these skills. This is a report from the World Economic Forum, which did a huge survey to look at what are the declining things we want in organizations and what are the growing requirements, and look at the growing requirements and how all of them align to innovation, thinking, learning, creativity, technology design, analysis, problem solving. All of those things are everything we need in cultures in order to drive innovation and build cultures of innovation. The challenge that we still face is, and these are some stats very, very recently from several surveys that my team have compiled. 75% of leaders still believe today they've already got this culture of innovation, this culture of experimentation and the ability for people to take risks. But only 37% of employees agree, right? 57% of companies, don't have formal innovation processes. So over half of companies out there are still trying to innovate in ad hoc ways because the system that innovation requires still hasn't been effectively built. And the majority of innovation that is happening, 78% of organizations categorize it as incremental. And that's because that process and that system isn't there. And it's because that culture of innovation still isn't there. There's a polarization between what many senior leaders believe is alive and well in organizations and the reality of what actually exists. And I think the challenge here is, in the last few minutes that I want to spend with you guys before questions, is I think the challenge is many leaders around the world, senior executives and senior teams and CEOs, have never been taught how to lead for innovation. Most of the senior teams I've worked with have had huge amounts of money spent on their professional development, their leadership development over their career. But the majority of that teaching and those business school programs and those executive development programs have been focused on how to lead in the traditional ways, how to lead for a linear world, when we're now in an unpredictable non-linear world, when we're now in a world that wants creativity and adaptability and innovation versus efficiency and production and meeting quarterly targets. The skills required for those businesses are different than the skills required for the businesses we need to build today and for the future. And the challenge is, going back to some of the things I shared with you earlier, if you look at all the research and the stats, most senior leaders are still unsure about what innovation really means for their organization. They're still unsure, because of that, how to align it to strategy and think strategically about innovation. And then that cascades down to not being sure about then how to lead and what their responsibilities for leading for innovation are. And therefore, how can they define the right outcomes? Those are the business ones. Think now and put yourselves in the shoes of senior leaders who need to drive this. They are mandated to drive and deliver innovation and build cultures of innovation. Think about what that means on an individual level, and the uncertainty and the challenge that poses for leaders when they've never been taught how to lead for the kind of world that we want them to lead. So here's a really quick overview of how we start to tackle this. This is what I call the ODC framework, and it's very simply, it's based on leaders should own the innovation agenda. Managers are there, and the people in the middle of an organization. Broadly, how do we get them to drive innovation and drive the innovation agenda? And then thirdly, how do we get everyone else in the organization to contribute to innovation? And that requires two things. It requires leaders, for example, to say, what do I need to do if I own the innovation agenda? What do I need to do to enable my managers and team leaders and influencers to drive innovation on a daily basis? And how will that then enable them to help all of the rest of our employees contribute to innovation on a daily basis? And it requires two components. What physically needs to be put in place? Strategy, assets, budget, processes, etc. And then on the right, what psychologically needs to be put in place? So how do people feel? How safe is the environment for them to do that? So psychological safety, etc. And unless we balance all of these things as leaders in terms of physical and psychological, we never create a balanced ecosystem and a balanced culture able to truly drive innovation across an organization. The final thing is, this has become really important, obviously, because of COVID. We're all working from home now, or the majority of us are working from home, and we're working on platforms like this, on Zoom or Teams, etc. And we're still trying to figure out what that means for innovation. And we're still trying to figure out, will we go back to an office? Will we work in an office 2 days a week? Are we forever destined to work from home? The challenge with innovation for me is that fundamentally it's a human thing. Creativity is a human thing. As humans, we feed off the interaction of others. We riff off others when we're physically together in a room. We creatively spark off others when we're collaboratively doing things physically in the same space. And we have to figure out how we're going to do that in the future, if we have to live with COVID or not. But how do we do that in a future which has made this almost instantaneous transition to remote working? And my view is we're going to need to go back into shared environments, specifically to innovate and to collaborate and to be creative. And maybe we do all that, the other parts of our jobs remotely, where we don't need, and there isn't a physical need to be with others. So physical workspace rules is my lesson. I genuinely think we are on the verge of a blended way of working. And I think innovation and creativity will be the catalyst for how we do that kind of work. So I'm going to leave you with 3 questions. And these are 3 fundamental questions that are sort of a summary of everything I've talked about. And these are 3 questions that have come up time and time again with the CEOs and teams that I work with. The first one is corporate innovation capability is a choice. We choose to build that capability. We choose to own it. We choose to develop that muscle as organizations. So it has to be a conscious leadership decision. So as leaders, what are you currently choosing to do? i.e., are you genuinely choosing to proactively and consciously build your innovation capability? Or are you subconsciously choosing to maintain what exists today? The second thing is that an innovation strategy for me is about the pursuit of better. It's about the pursuit of doing more and doing better and building a better world. And that's why it aligns to purpose so well. So the question is, do you genuinely have an innovation strategy, and more importantly, a strategy for building your innovation system? Have you doubled down on purpose? i.e., are you genuinely purpose-driven? And are they both aligned? Is your innovation system strategy and your core purpose absolutely aligned? And the third one is, as leaders, we can't influence results. What we can influence is behavior and processes, which in turn lead to the outcomes. They lead to the results we want. So the final question is, will our current leadership approach, and ask yourselves this, will our current leadership approach and our current culture enable us to shape and build the future that we want, to shape and build the kind of organization that we want to become? So if you want to shape the future, for me, that Drucker quote needs to be reframed for the world that we live in today. And my view is that strategy, leadership, and culture now need to eat breakfast together, and culture doesn't eat strategy for breakfast. That enables that's going to mean that we have to be a little bit bold, a little bit crazy, a lot more ambitious, and a lot more visionary. We just don't want to be batshit crazy. And finally, before I take some questions, this is how the Global Innovation Institute can help. You know, there's people like me all over the world, but there's brilliant organizations, and I'm really proud to be part of this organization and sit on the board. But have a look at this slide at your leisure. Go on to Genie's website. All of the things that I've talked about today, there's a part of Genie that can help your organizations and your teams solve these complex problems and build that innovation culture, build that innovation strategy, change how you lead for innovation. So when you get the PDF, have a look at the links depending on where you are in the world, and get in touch with the representative from Genie in your part of the world, and have a conversation about how the Institute can help. Now I think it's time to ask me anything, but again, if there is anything you want to know, you can get me on email, you can follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. And you can check out my website, and then Outcome, which is the firm I run with Dan Toma. And then also check out our maturity model on the-aim.co. And Anthony, that is it from me. I hope you all enjoyed that. Let me stop sharing, and then we've got a quarter of an hour for questions.
Yes, and thank you, Cris. That was excellent. I certainly enjoyed it. So for the rest of our time together, we want to open the floor up to Cris for questions to Cris. So feel free to unmute yourself and then jump in with whatever questions you have. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Ladies first. That's fine. Ladies first.
Oh,
okay, thank you.
Go, Shona.
So Shona, and then Raoul will go to you.
Thanks very much, Cris. First of all, thank you. I really enjoyed it. My question to you as a consultant is, I'm really curious, when you engage with your clients, have they got to the point where now it's a crisis for them, where they now, oh gosh, we're ready to innovate now because they're forced into it? Or are you finding that more and more of your clients are, starting to have that realization and call you before there's a crisis? I ask because I usually have the former.
So there aren't that. So the crisis isn't because of COVID, for example.
Right.
The crisis typically is I will get called in when an organization has spent huge amounts of money on innovation, or in the name of innovation.
Yeah.
They've maybe had other consultants in before. They've probably had some of the big consultants, and they've spent huge amounts of money with those consultants and have yielded little to no results. So there's a frustration that they've opened labs, they've sheep dipped people through entrepreneurship programs. They've done all of the things that they were supposed to do, or that they presumed they were supposed to do, and the narrative will be, Cris, and I won't mention the name of the client, but Cris, we've had X consultancy in for the past 2 years. We've spent $4 million and we've got nothing.
All right.
We've literally got nothing, we need to leverage that investment. Like, we don't know which parts of it are right and which parts of it were bad advice, or which parts of it we should never have done in the first place. And there's a real frustration that all of that time, effort, and resources hasn't yielded anything. It's very, very rare that I will, and I say this is very rare, but I have one conversation going on at the moment, but it's very rare where a client says, innovation's just never been on our agenda. We've never even done anything. We're right at the start of a journey. can you help us from day one? That's very, very rare. So.
Okay, thanks.
No
Raul?
Raul.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you, Anthony, for being part of the organization. Starting with yesterday, basically, I am part of junior organization as well. Thanks again. And have a sort of a tricky question, which may follow up later with further discussion. Why these people, the senior managers, believe that they are leaders and basically they are just managers? It's a long, short question. Sorry for that.
So let's not. Okay. So first of all, we shouldn't generalize that because,
Correct.
Yeah. I think the challenge is we live in a world where organizational architecture hasn't really changed for the past 100 years. And there's a chronology to, you know, how people move up. You start as an employee, then you're a team leader, you know, then you're a junior manager, then you're a manager, you know, then you're a head of, then you're, you know, at some point you become this metaphorical leader. And the challenge is that leadership badge is associated with a level in an organization. Now that is fundamentally changing all over the world, but inherently that is still the architecture that most organizations still work under depicts people at a certain level in the organization as a leader. The reality is, as we all know, leaders are everywhere in an organization, and leadership predominantly is badgeless, right? And there are many aspects to leadership, depending on organizational context. I think the challenge is most people are told that they are now in a leadership role. Therefore, by association, they go, well, I must be a leader then. But their actions, but they've never really been taught how to be a leader. So mindset, actions, behavior, you know, they haven't really been given the toolkit to go, okay, this is what real leadership is. So I think for many, leadership is a presumptive title because the business says you are now in a leadership, you are now at leadership level. And that's a challenge that's, I mean, it is being tackled, right? You know, the whole context of leadership and who are leaders is changing on a daily basis.
One more question, and I leave
Sure.
the others later.
Uh-huh.
Why the so-called leaders or managers, they are continuously missing the vision of their business? Because on the other hand, they report to the board of the directors of the shareholders or whatever they wanted to call. They want it. That's cool, but it's part of the sort of project management as definition to assess the risk. What is happening if COVID will come in the next 2 years? Are we going to survive or not? What we are going to do against this risk? It's a simple question where the leaders, so-called leaders, never ask. They are root to the daily business on supervising the manufacturing, sales, incomes, paying getting the revenue as much as possible, and that's about it. And still, the question is why these leaders are missing vision.
So again, I don't want to generalize and label every organization on the planet with the same, but I'll give you from my context, the majority, and you know, if I put a percentage on it, I'd say probably 90% of organizations I work with and have worked with, and you know, to put that into context, that's some of the you know, if I just started throwing names out, everyone on here would go, yeah, well, obviously I know them, they're global, etc. Most of them don't actually have a vision, right? So
yeah.
they don't really actually have one. And one of the challenges is the visions are basically just a very, very tiny version of their strategic goals for the next few years. You know, there aren't many organizations that really understand purpose and vision, right? You know, why do we exist? What's our raison d'etre? Why did this organization start in the first place? Yeah. And what are we still here to do? And then vision, what do we want to achieve? Yeah. If this is why we exist, what do we want to achieve? What's our vision for delivering against that purpose? Even just that very, very simple difference there. Most organizations don't have those two contexts. So different leaders will have different versions of what they say they want to achieve, whether it's in their business unit or their division. So again, there's never this overarching guide North Star that everyone says, this is why we exist. This is what we're doing. You know, we're going to save, you know, our vision is to save 1 billion lives or whatever it is, right? Our, you know, look at something like you know, this came up in a conversation yesterday. Look at something like Volvo. You know, no one will die. No one will ever die in our cars. Or it's not exactly those words, but, you know, that's incredibly powerful. It's not we will make the safest cars. It's no one will die in our cars, right? That kind of thing really, really inspires people. That's why people join companies, right? That's why people give that extra time and that commitment. And when we talk about creativity and innovation, right? You can't contractually, right, in terms of someone's employment contract, you can't contractually force someone to be creative, right? You can't contractually, you can't contractually say, well, you weren't creative enough there, therefore you're fired, right? Creativity and problems and all of those, what it really takes to do that is what I call the willing contribution, right? People and employees have to be inspired, they have to be passionate, they have to believe in what you want to do as an organization and what you want to achieve. Then you get real creativity for people because they're purpose driven. It's back to that leadership thing I showed you earlier, that real purpose driven, curious leader that says, I'm going to experiment, I'm going to try new things, right? You can't contractually make people do that. That comes when someone says, I really, really, really want to help my organization deliver against that. And that's the leader's role, is to build that kind of environment. And that's what is still missing in a lot of organizations around the world.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions from anyone else?
Chris, there were some questions posed in the chat screen.
Okay.
I don't know if you have that open or not,
Yeah.
but one was about the intersection of innovation and sustainability, in the sense that how do we ensure that we're innovating in a way that's not just flash in the pan, but keep things going. So because innovation fatigue can crush the culture in the organization.
Sure.
if it's not sustained in the right way.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that. One, you know, innovation fatigue really creeps in when organizations haven't built that innovation system. So when there's more theater than actual, you know, real ownership of innovation, i.e., and it's almost back to that cartoon I showed at the start, the senior team, the CEO saying, we want innovation, we need to build a culture of innovation, it's really important. But actually they're not doing what it takes to build that. So, you know, there's a rallying cry across an organization for, we want innovation, we want ideas, you know, we want you to solve problems. And employees get behind that and go, right, I've got ideas. Okay, I've got this and I've got this. And then there's no process, there's no system, there's no funding, you know, there's no mechanism for doing anything with that. So, you know, you go back to that metaphorical suggestion box, right? Where the ideas go in and that's it, they've gone. And this is what I call organizational cry wolf, right? Employees will only do that a few times before they go, oh, here we go. You know, we said we wanted to innovate 2 years ago and it didn't happen. And we did it last year, and we held an innovation festival and we opened a lab. right? And nothing happened. And oh, we're doing it again. And there's a different consultant in this time. And innovation's now important again. Well, I've presented 15 ideas over the past 3 years, and I haven't even had a reply, and I don't even know what happened to any of them. So that fatigue sets in, right? When you build the right system, so the other part of the question is this intersection around sustainability and innovation and all of those things, whether it's sustainability or not, when you build the right system, your core strategic drivers, i.e., when you build the right system, you would build an innovation thesis. And the innovation thesis would say, here's what we want to focus on. Here's what innovation means to us, and here's where we're going to focus. We will pursue this, and we will pursue this, and we do want to tackle this, and we do want to tackle that. And then also the antithesis says, but also we're not going to do this, and we're not going to do anything in this space. And I don't know, we fundamentally will never ever look at anything that's to do with, I don't know, cannabis or whatever, right? Or the manufacture of military equipment or guns or whatever it is, because those are principle-based decisions. And you then align all of your innovation activity to that innovation thesis. And if sustainability or whatever else is on there, then it makes it really clear then for everyone in the organization, this is where we're innovating, this is what I need to get behind, and this is where the business wants me to focus. So it also stops that fatigue where people aren't just throwing ideas into the hat that the business actually doesn't strategically want. So it streamlines that whole innovation effort.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Does anyone want to answer or ask one? Or I could read one more off the chat. Does anyone have a question you want to pose? Marcelo?
Yes.
Oh,
thank you.
I've just read yours, Marcello. I've just read yours. So presumably,
okay.
Are you going to ask the same question?
Yes. I want to ask if you know any platform or tool that measures the culture of innovation.
There are tools that measure culture. So if you purely want to measure culture and purely culture, then there's a tool called InnoQuotient, headed up by a guy called Fran Chuan, very good friend of mine. So Fran, but that purely measures culture. We have a tool called AIM. So on the last page of the PDF, it's the-aim.co. That measures innovation maturity. So that's the combination, which is more important. That's the combination of innovation capability and how well the business understands innovation and has all of the things in place for innovation, and the combination of how well all of that is embedded into culture. That's more important, because this is the yin and the yang that most organizations get wrong. They'll do the strategy bit and they'll say, right, we've gone big on design thinking. That's our approach. We've built our strategy, and now we're just going to go off doing stuff and trying to create stuff. But they miss the yin and the yang bit. The other bit is the culture bit. And maturity and innovation capability is about the combination of both of those. So AIM, which is the tool, measures both of those and as a level of maturity.
Very good. Well, thank you
very much.
Yeah, I was just going to add one other thing to what you had to say earlier, Chris, about some of the leadership is, sometimes it's not the leaders to blame themselves, it's the education they've been given, because the traditional MBA programs that most people go to are structured to teach them operations, how to operate what they currently do. Most MBA programs are not structured to teach innovation and future shaping and strategic futuring. And so a lot of leaders come out of MBA programs thinking they know how to lead a business, and they're completely missing that element, and they don't even know they're missing that element. And so sometimes we're the product of our graduate education program. And one of the things the Institute has been doing here and there is to try to help influence some of the graduate education programs to incorporate more about innovation and not just purely operations.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree, and I mentioned that on one of the leadership slides, and you know, the reality is most of the senior teams that I work with, you know, I start from a position of actually feeling really sorry for them, and I think, but I mean that, I don't mean that in a negative way, but you know, I don't think many employees really appreciate how difficult that the leadership role is today in the world that we operate in, with the pressure that organizations are under to adapt, to be agile, you know, to innovate, to be creative. It's huge pressure, and we place that pressure on leaders, on the board, on the C-suite. And you're right. And I teach at business schools, right? And I still maintain, you know, I've been very vocal over the past several years about we are not doing enough for senior leadership teams when it comes to the pressure they're under to drive and deliver innovation. And they've had some of the senior teams I work with, when I go in with them, one of the first things I ask them is, add up over the last 5 to 10 years, all of the man hours, let's just try and put a number on the man hours that the business has invested in you in terms of your leadership development, whether you've been to a business school, whether you've had coaches, add it all up into hours. And now let's try and just put an arbitrary, you know, cost per hour. Let's just roughly try and add up what the business has spent on your leadership development. And in some cases, it's millions and millions of dollars. You know, if you've got a senior board of 10, 12 people, over the last decade, they will have had millions of dollars spent on them as leaders. And the final question then I say is, give me now a percentage, give me a percentage of how much of all of that exec education has been focused on shaping the future versus maintaining today. And in most instances, it's, you know, the balance is the wrong way, right? You know, there aren't many clients that give me a figure more than 20%. But on a daily basis, they're being asked to deliver everything with 80% of what they've been taught to do is skills for maintaining what exists.
Exactly.
So, you know, we have to help leaders and senior executives and key influencers and managers. We have to help them understand how to lead for innovation. But it's going to take time. The challenge is businesses want results today, but developing those skills in leaders takes time.
It does. Okay, well, I think we're out of time for today. I want to thank everyone who has attended and participated. Thank you so much, very much. And especially thank you, Cris, for your expertise and sharing your time and insights and experience with us. We very much valued that. And so with that, we'll call it a wrap and wish everyone a good evening.
Yeah. Anyone, I'm seeing questions come in, so reach out to me on LinkedIn, drop me an email, and if I can answer them, then I'd be glad to answer them offline. So thanks, everyone.
Very good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.